thank you for that lovely welcome. I am really honored and happy to be here. This is my first visit to Taiwan, and it's been delightful. I have had some really lovely hosts. Thomas Lee from Titansoft has been taking good care of me, and my colleague Don Gray, who is also here with me. We're teaching a workshop later in the week. So I want to say, I'm not sure what the introduction said about me, so I'm going to say a little bit more about me. I started my career as a programmer. I don't know how many of you knew that about me, but I started out as a programmer. And if you knew what language I liked best, you would know when I started out as a programmer. So does anyone care to guess what my favorite language is? Exactly. I like assembler. It's close to the metal, and you're down there with the bits, and you can control what's going on. So over the years, I've worn many hats. As I said, I was a programmer. Are there any other programmers in the room? Anybody else who was a programmer or is a programmer? Yeah, okay, lots of programmers. I did some testing. Any testers in the room? I've been a manager. I've been an internal consultant. I've owned my own company since 1997. And over all that time, I've had an opportunity to observe leadership and observe how leadership works, particularly in an agile context. So today I really want to focus on what it means to be a leader when you are wanting to be agile, wanting to do agile, and moving towards agile methods. So how many of you think of yourself as a leader now? How many of you think you're leaders? Raise your hand if you think you're a leader. Okay, that's a few. How many of you have a formal title or a formal leadership role? Raise your hand if you have a formal leadership role. Yeah, okay, so not too many people raised their hands about having a formal leadership role, but a lot of you raised your hands saying that you were a leader. And I wonder if by the end of this talk we can maybe get some more people to raise their hands to say that they are a leader. So some common definitions of leadership, that it flows from positional authority. So those of you who raised your hand who said you have a formal leadership role, that you have positional authority. With that role comes certain responsibilities, certain decision-making authority. You can, to some extent, tell people what to do. They may or may not do it, but you can try telling them what to do. It's very, very common for people to think of leadership as taking charge, going in and taking charge, assuming control of the situation, getting things organized, and telling people what to do. Leadership is also associated with being inspiring. So inspiring people towards a vision. You have the vision and you get people to go in the direction you want them to go in, or motivating people to do certain things. Some people define leadership as simply the act of getting other people to do what you want them to do. So I think that these definitions are sort of limited. So all of these traditional definitions of leadership, and they are primarily Western definitions of leadership, assume that you have a position, that you can persuade people, that you have charisma. I think that these definitions are both limited and they impose limits on organizations. So formal authority does give you the right to tell people to do things, but I have observed that most people don't really love being told what to do. Is that true for you guys? Yeah. Most people don't love being told what to do. It impinges on their autonomy, right? When people are told what to do, they often don't feel much ownership. They have not created the solution. They have not thought it through deeply. They've just been told to go do something. So people aren't as engaged. People don't feel ownership for things. Taking charge, another common way we think about leadership, there are certainly times when someone must take charge. If the building is on fire, we need someone to take charge. If the boat is about to run into the dock, we need someone to take charge. But there are a lot of situations where things are actually going along okay. They don't need someone to come in and tell people what to do. People who tend to take charge often alienate other people because nobody likes to be bossed around, right? And at the extreme, take charge people sometimes have trouble collaborating with others. So that limits collaboration in an organization. When you look at charisma, when you look at influence, when you look at being able to talk people into doing something, that idea really limits leadership to people who are able to inspire people because of their personality, because of their stature, because of their looks. There's actually a lot of research on how height and looks influence leadership. People who are tall and good looking are much more likely to be elevated to formal positions of leadership. So these definitions are very limited, and they limit organizations in that they make them slower because people are waiting to be told what to do, and they make people less engaged, which means people aren't going to put in extra effort to solve problems and work on things. I would like to propose a different definition of leadership, in that leadership is the ability to enhance the environment so that everyone is empowered to contribute creatively. I think this is the essence of leadership, and it's a really important definition, particularly in Agile organizations and organizations that are trying to be more agile in the way they work, in the way they deliver products, in the way they respond to markets. This definition came from Jerry Weinberg. How many of you have heard of Jerry Weinberg? A few of you have heard of Jerry Weinberg. He was a good friend of mine. And I find this definition is very, very helpful. This definition says that the most important thing we can do is make it possible for other people to contribute creatively. It's the most important thing. And it is a profound act of leadership to make the environment so that other people, yourself and other people, can all contribute, no matter what your title or your level. So I want to talk about 3 things that I think are essential to creating an environment where you can have leaders at all levels. In my experience, when a company gets over, say, 20 people, knowledge starts to bifurcate, which is kind of a big word that means split in 2. So the people who started a company, the first circle of people who started a company, they know everything about it. They know the market, they know the customers, they know the value proposition, they know what it's about, they know the technology, they know everything. But as you hire more people, the first round of people who get hired often get to know those things. The second round of people know less because they've generally been hired to do a certain thing. And by the time you get to 20 or 30 people, there's really this split in the knowledge. And the certain people who were there from the start, they understand the contextual information. And the people who were hired later, they understand the technical information. They understand how to get the day-to-day jobs done, but they may not understand the market, the customers, value proposition, why you're in business. This makes companies slow. I had a conversation with a CEO a while ago whose company was out of startup stage. They were probably at about 700 people. And he was complaining that he could no longer find people who took initiative. In his entire country, he couldn't find anyone who took initiative anymore. And I suspect what was happening was that the knowledge had bifurcated. Right? So people didn't understand enough to take action on their own. People had to wait to be told what to do, or they would make mistakes. This is very common. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Has anyone experienced this? Yeah, I see some heads nodding. Yeah. So, one of the most important things you can do is to make the overlap between the contextual knowledge and the day-to-day knowledge bigger. I refer to that as the diamond. So make the diamond bigger. Why is this so important? When there is a bifurcation, as I said, things slow down because people have to wait to be told what to do. But it also erodes trust because people on both ends of that triangle don't have the information to make good decisions anymore. So the people at the top of the organization may not understand what it takes to actually build software anymore, particularly if they haven't touched software for 20 years. So they may not understand how difficult it is to actually build working software. They may have experienced the code base when it was young and clean, and they don't understand how difficult it can be to work with a legacy code base. So they may expect things very, very quickly, when the reality is they can't be done very, very quickly anymore because there's layers of bureaucracy, because the code base has degraded, and so forth. So the people at the top of the organization may be requesting things that seem ridiculous to the people lower in the organization. On the flip side, when people lower in the organization don't understand the context, they also make foolish decisions sometimes, or appear foolish. When I was a dev manager, we were developing some software to trade various sorts of derivative financial instruments, and it was quite challenging, quite difficult work, and it was going to take a long time to program. And one of the programmers said, "This is going to take me half a year. Why don't we just tell the traders not to trade those?" Well, half a year of her salary was probably, 1% of the value of one of these trades. So she didn't understand the value proposition. It wasn't because she was stupid. It wasn't because she was not a smart person. It was because she lacked the context, right? So when there isn't an overlap in the information, people cannot make good decisions on either end. So make the diamond bigger. We all like diamonds, right? Yeah, we all like diamonds. I spoke to one group that was doing Scrum by the book, and by some definition they were doing it perfectly. They were doing all of the ceremonies, they were having retrospectives, they were grooming their backlog, they were doing all of those Scrum things very, very well. But when I talked to them, they didn't know who their customer was. So how could they be meeting their customers' needs? They didn't know who the customer was. So we made the diamond bigger. We made the diamond bigger so that they understood more about the customer. And once they met the customers and they started understanding how the customers use their software, they saw different solutions. They saw different ways to implement stories. They got to know how those people worked. They got to know them as people. And they made much better software as a result. So make the diamond bigger. If you want more engagement, you want better decisions, you want leaders at all levels, make the diamond bigger. Another thing we have to pay attention to is what the psychologists call voice. So voice has to do with the ability to speak up, literally to use your voice, to ask questions, to raise issues, to bring forward ideas. It sounds easy, doesn't it? But it's not. It's not. There is always a risk in bringing up unhappy news in any situation, because people might get upset, people might get angry. You know, if you bring up an idea that isn't fully formed, people might dismiss your idea. When you add in hierarchy, it makes it much, much harder. Hierarchy adds a certain amount of friction and risk to bringing up ideas, to bringing up bad news, to bringing up questions, right? Because you might be interrogated. You know, someone might want to know, well, what's your data? What's your proof? And sometimes when we become aware of a problem, particularly when a problem is small, we don't have data. We don't have data. We have a hunch, right? We have a feeling that something's not quite right. Maybe we can't quite say why, but we know something's wrong. There's a very famous story in a book by Malcolm Gladwell about an ancient sculpture that was put on the market. They're called curi. They're Greek statues of a particular period. And this statue was found, and they did some chemical tests on it, and they believed that it was actually a genuine, an astonishing find. But some of the experts had a feeling. They had a feeling something was wrong with this statue. They did some more tests, and the tests indicated that it was genuine. They did some carbon dating, and it looked like it was about the right age. But still, these few experts thought there's something wrong about this. And eventually, they figured out what it was. It was something in the way the fingernails were carved on this statue. They typically stand very still, and there was just something in the way the fingernails that were carved was not the way they were done in the genuine article. So dozens of people had just looked at the chemical analysis and so forth and said, this is genuine. The guy with the hunch was right. But in a lot of places, you can't bring up a hunch, right? You'll get interrogated. So I think it's really important to make it easy for people to bring things up. Sometimes people make a little ritual of it, and they just have a way that in our organization, this is how we talk about hunches. You know, I have a feeling, or I have a hunch, or I have a sense that something isn't right here. This is what I've looked at. This is why I'm worried. This is the potential impact. And that gives you the opportunity to monitor and pay attention and see if it really becomes a problem. But only if you're willing to listen to that kind of, you know, potentially bad news. When organizations make it so that people aren't able to bring up bad news, they don't hear about problems when they're little. They only hear about problems when they're big and harder to solve, and you have fewer options. So when people's voice is diminished, your organization is much more prone to risk. It's much more prone to these catastrophic failures appearing supposedly out of nowhere. So make it easy for people to bring things up. Invite problems. I sometimes, when I'm working with with senior managers, I will ask them, if I hear about, or if I learn about, or suspect there's a problem with this project or with this initiative that we're doing, when would you want me to tell you about it? And they always say right away. They always say, well, of course, I'd want to know right away. I say, okay, now I have implicit permission to tell them, right, if something has gone wrong. So that's a useful question to ask. You know, if something goes wrong, when would you want to know about it? You know, at the last moment, or would you want to know about it earlier? Would you want to know about it earlier when you have more options? So we need to make it easy for people to bring things up. Now, if you are in a formal leadership position, those of you who raised your hand to that question, you can ask people, you know, if you have a sense that something's going wrong, I'd like to know about it right away. I might be disappointed, I might be unhappy, I might even be upset, but I'm not upset with you. I'm upset with the situation, and I need to know about it so I have options. If you're on a team, you know, be willing to entertain those questions. You know, be willing to listen to the junior programmer who might see something with new eyes that you don't necessarily see. Because when we have been in an organization for a while, we tend not to see certain things. So a little story about that. I used to have an office that was off my kitchen, and it had the door to the kitchen, and it had another door that went to the living room, which I didn't like because people would walk into my office. So I put a bookcase in front of the door so that it was not accessible and people wouldn't come in. But one day, my refrigerator stopped working on a holiday weekend when it was not going to be easy to get a new refrigerator. So I had to have people come and move my refrigerator, and somehow they got it stuck in the door. Well, you know, that's not the worst problem, except that I was taking care of someone's toddler in my office, and the toddler needed to go potty while the refrigerator was blocking the way. And I'm like thinking, what am I going to do? Lift this kid out the window and hope he makes it to the ground, hold the waste basket on it. What am I going to do? And the toddler said, there's a door, which I didn't think about because I was used to thinking of it as a door bookcase. So we moved, the toddler and I moved the books and moved the bookcase, and off he went, and everything was fine. But this just illustrates that when you are around something for a while, there are certain things you do not see. So a newcomer, sometimes even a 4-year-old newcomer, can see things, well, we might have been closer to 3. A 3-year-old sees things that you don't see anymore. Now, we're not working with toddlers at work, but we are often working with people who are new to the company. So give those people voice, even if they're new, even if they're asking questions that seem like they've been answered before, because sometimes looking at something from a new perspective will give you new insights about it. Sometimes newcomers will ask a question that leads you to remember something or think about something that you'd forgotten about or that you just took for granted. So whether you are in a formal position or not, you can help give people voice. Give them the chance to talk. So the third thing we need to do is really, I think in some ways, the area where middle managers are most involved. Are there any middle managers in the room? Raise your hand if you're a middle manager. Yeah, a couple middle managers. So I think middle management is a really hard job, and it's a job that in many ways doesn't get a lot of respect, particularly in the US. I remember when Agile was first coming out people would often say, we don't need managers, we don't need line managers, and they were very dismissive of them. And some line managers, when they started hearing about Scrum Masters and looking at the roles in Agile, felt like, oh, there's not a place for me here. I don't see a role for manager here. And so their sense of where they belonged in the organization was threatened. Nobody wants to hear like you're not valued here. There's no place for you. But I actually think it's a really important role. It's not a kind of a middle ground while you're waiting for something else. It can be a really strategic role. And middle managers can create the conditions for teams by paying attention to what the teams need and creating, making sure they understand priorities, making sure they have access to information, making sure that the teams have the skills they need or access to outside expertise if they don't actually have those skills on the team, that they have a connection to the organization so they actually do know who their customer is. They're not waiting. One of the most important things they can do in terms of making their organization faster and creating the conditions for leaders is making it clear what the decision boundaries are. So in the Agile world, there's been a lot of talk about autonomous teams. How many of you have heard people talking about autonomous teams? Yeah. So teams exist within a context, and they always have certain constraints within a context. Like the software team cannot decide to relocate the headquarters of the company, right? The software team cannot decide to shut down a line of business. So there's always some constraints within there. They are autonomous in how they meet particular goals. It's also important for them to know what sort of decisions they can make. And this is where I think middle managers can really be helpful in having those conversations about what decisions do I need to make? What decisions do we make together? What decisions can the team make on their own? Right, setting those boundaries. I worked with one organization where I asked the managers to sort their decisions into those three categories. What they have to make either because of legal or financial reasons, what decisions could be shared with the team, and what decisions they could give to the team. Most groups, when I do this, they end up saying, oh, there's a lot of things the team can decide. I don't need to be in the middle of that. But this one particular set of managers said that the teams could decide their team name from a list. They could pick a name from a list of Mexican wrestlers. They could decide what their working agreements were, and they could decide how to spend the snack budget. These were people with at least bachelor's degrees. Many of them had master's degrees, and they were told, you can decide how to spend the snack budget. That's treating them like babies. So on one hand, I get it, because the managers felt like, well, if we're not making decisions, what are we doing? What value are we adding if we're not making decisions? We're very busy making decisions all day long, therefore we have value. I actually think when managers aren't, burdened in that way, they can actually be much more strategic. They can really step into leadership looking at how can we enhance the ability of people to get work done? How can we develop people? How can we improve the way the system functions, rather than making themselves bottlenecks or treating the software teams like babies? So that group recognized what was going on. And they also recognized that at their company, remember the diamond? The diamond was pretty tiny. So they had to make the diamond bigger so that their teams could take advantage of their smarts and their education and actually make decisions so that they could go faster. right? So they weren't always waiting for their overburdened managers to make a decision or have it go up 7 layers of management and come back down. So they had conversations about what are the boundaries, what are the decisions you can make. You can choose your own testing tools as long as they are compatible with X, Y, and Z. You can spend up to this amount of money on your testing tools. You can choose as long as it's going to work with what this other team is doing. So there were some constraints around it. There were some boundaries around it. But within that, the teams could make their own decisions about what to do. Now, when you have explicit conversations about what the boundaries are, people know, and it doesn't mean you never go beyond that boundary. It means that if you bump into the boundary, it's time to have a conversation and make a decision. So, for example, when I remodeled my kitchen a few years ago, I had a budget in mind. I wanted to spend a certain amount of money and no more. The design firm came back to me with 3 options. They said, we can spend a little less than your budget and it will be a little better, but we can improve this, we'll knock out this wall, you have a little counter here, you won't have much more space in the kitchen, won't have more cabinet space, but it'll be a little better because there'll be, you'll be able to see, into the other room. It'll improve the social space a little bit. And they had an option that was a lot more money than I wanted to spend and, involved things that I didn't necessarily care about. And they had an option that was right what I wanted to spend, and they had an option that was probably 20% more than I wanted to spend. But it was fabulous. It was going to change the entire social space of the house. It was going to make the kitchen much more usable. It was going to increase the storage space. So I found the money, right? That boundary was there to signal a conversation. It wasn't there to say, no, you can never go beyond it. So, going back to the team, if they find a testing tool that is going to be fabulous, but it costs, $5,000 more than the budget, well, then maybe you have that conversation and you decide, yeah, the benefit outweighs the boundary. So super, super useful to have these conversations, makes it explicit, and also communicates that you can talk about these things. You can have a conversation about what the boundaries are, right? These are not things that are, just set by someone else. So you may be wondering why this picture is up here. Is anyone wondering about this picture of this little dog jumping? That's a picture of my neighbor's dog, my old neighbors. They don't live next to me anymore, but my old neighbors had they had something called invisible fence. Do you have that here? It's illegal in some places, but it's not illegal in the U.S. And what it is they bury a wire under the ground, usually around the perimeter of the yard, usually around the yard. And the dog wears a special collar so that when the dog gets near the wire, they get a shock. Well, for one thing, it doesn't keep the bears out of the yard. And there are bears that wander through the yards in my neighborhood. So it wouldn't protect the dogs from the bears. And if the dog's running really fast, they're just going to keep going. But my neighbors didn't bury the wire. They were going to put up a garage, and they didn't want to have to bury it twice. So here's this wire just kind of laying on the lawn. And when the wind would blow, the wire would move. So those dogs never knew where the wire was going to be on any given day. And pretty soon, they didn't want to leave the porch because they never knew when they were going to get a shock. It's a terrible story, isn't it? They were mostly really nice people, but I must confess to having some judgments about the wire. So you don't want to have that happen to your teams. You don't want your teams to be guessing where the decision boundary is on any given day. when I was, long ago, when I was a programmer, all of our managers were at an offsite with strict instructions that they were not to be bothered for any reason. This was before mobile phones were common. And they were off at this fancy resort doing, we didn't know what they were doing, manager things. And the system blew up. Just blew up. And the portfolios weren't going to get priced, and the fund managers were going to be mad, and they couldn't trade, and it was really bad. And we got together and figured out what to do, and a fairly junior person without a management title was the one who made the decision about how we were going to take action. It was the right decision. We figured out what to do. We got the system back up and running. And when her manager came back, she was severely reprimanded for making a decision that was not appropriate for her grade level. So, that's not what we want to do to people. If we want leaders at all levels, we really want them to be able to step in, know what the boundaries are, have conversations about the boundaries, but be able to make decisions without being fearful that they're going to be slapped or shocked. We don't want that. So when we create the conditions where people can have the contextual knowledge to make decisions, to understand their customers, when we make the diamond bigger, when we give people voice, when we communicate and articulate what the boundaries are, when we have that conversation, we are not only leading, those are all leadership actions, but we are creating the conditions and adapting the environment so that everyone else can be more effective, so that everyone else can step into leadership. It's possible for everyone. When we think in terms of systems, complex systems, the original purpose of hierarchy is always to help the originating subsystem do their jobs better, to create a balance between coordinated action towards a goal and healthy self-organization. This is always the goal of hierarchy from a systems perspective. And I think this is very useful to remember when we think about hierarchy in organizations. It's always the job of the hierarchy to help the subsystems do their jobs more effectively. When we do this, we're going to end up with better and faster decisions, greater flexibility, and increased engagement. And people at all levels are going to be able to step into their leadership. People at all levels are going to be leaders. So, leadership doesn't depend on hierarchy. There are leaders at every level. I've talked about some of the things that make it possible for everybody to step into leadership. But I want to give you some specific examples. So you might recognize different kinds of leadership, the kind that makes it possible for everyone to contribute creatively when you see them. And it might give you some ideas about what you can do. So when we talk about the definition of leadership, it's the ability to adapt the environment so that everybody can contribute creatively to solving problems. What that requires is expanding the diamond, giving voice, articulating boundaries. It also requires the ability to observe what's happening so you can see what's going on around you in your group or perhaps in your larger organization. You can interpret your observations based on some model, There are many models of teamwork out there. There are many models of complex systems. There's many models that we can use. Take action, and then evaluate whether your action has worked and whether you need to try something else. So that's what you need to be able to do. So some examples. I was in a meeting where a conversation, I was not facilitating, I will point out. I was in a meeting where the conversation was just swirling around. It was just going in circles. I couldn't keep track of what people were really trying to decide. So I said, can we please write down the options we're considering? And the person leading the meeting said, don't be such a pain. We all know what we're talking about. And I said, yeah, well, indulge me. Let's just write it down. We're only talking about 3 things. I said, well, I'm having trouble keeping track. I can't participate if I can't understand what we're talking about. So they finally wrote them down, and it turned out there were 7 different options that weren't explicit. Everybody had kind of a different idea about what they were talking about. So I think that was an act of leadership, to just say, I don't understand what's going on. I can't follow. Can we write it down? So I observed myself in this case, that I couldn't follow what was going on. I acted. I interpreted by saying, maybe we need to be clear about what we're talking about. Maybe I'm not the only one who has these questions. I acted by asking the question and being a little persistent. And that resulted in an adjustment to the environment of writing down the 7, not 3, options that were under consideration. So I think that's an act of leadership. Another time, I put up was when I was a programmer, I put up a big chart of all of the programs, and when one of them would blow up, I would stick a push pin in that program, in the picture of that, in that program in the picture. And someone then asked me what was going on. Why was I doing that? And I said, well, I have observed that we get called in the middle of the night because these programs blow up, and I want to see if there's any patterns. I want to know if there's any patterns here. Pretty soon, other people started putting push pins in too. And then we had some data. And then people started acting differently. So people would be more careful when they went into those programs. And they started doing, we didn't call it refactoring then, but they started refactoring parts of the program. And, if there was any change affecting them, people would do some extra testing. So I observed something about the environment. We get called in at night. That's no fun. I had a model that we didn't have data about what was going on. I took some action, making this, getting this chart printed. That was actually the hardest part, was getting that chart printed, and then just putting push pins in the wall, right? I didn't have to take charge. I didn't have to persuade people. I didn't have to be charismatic about it and create a vision of, this wonderful job stream that never blows up. I just observed and took action. It wasn't difficult. I wasn't brave. I wasn't charismatic. I just, I was just being a leader. So there's all sorts of examples like that. I bet you can think of some too. I bet you can think of some examples where you have been a leader. A few weeks ago, I was in a meeting where people were, again, brainstorming some ideas, and ideas were getting lost, and someone brought out the Post-its. They didn't take charge. They didn't say, oh, you should be writing your ideas down on Post-its. They just put the Post-its out on the table. They observed that, ideas were being lost or ideas were being evaluated prematurely. We put the Post-it notes out, which made it possible for them to take a different approach and start actually writing down their ideas. I think that was leadership. So it doesn't depend on hierarchy. It doesn't depend on charisma. It doesn't depend on having a formal position or being persuasive. There are leaders at all levels. You are a leader now, no matter what level you are, if you choose to be. So here's my challenge to you as you think about your group and the people you work with. What do you notice about that group, about the way you're working? And what is the smallest thing you could do to help everyone in your group be more effective? What is the smallest thing you could do that would adjust the environment to help everyone in your group contribute more creatively? And what would it take for you to do that? So at the beginning of this talk, I asked you to raise your hand if you think of yourself as a leader. And I've given you some ideas and examples about what leadership at all levels can look like. So I wonder, of those of you who didn't put your hand up at the beginning, if any of you would put your hand up now. Are there any new people who would put their hand up and say you're a leader? Yeah, there's a couple more hands up. Because you don't need to take charge. You don't need to have a title. You just need to adjust your environment so that you and others can contribute more creatively. And then you will be a leader. Thank you very, very much.